Happy New Year. Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in Washington State. I'm Brett Davis, Washington State editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing Washington City's asking the state to raise the cap on annual property taxes, a regional homeless organization being asked to address the homelessness crisis with less federal and state money in 2025, and law enforcement and recruiting efforts in the Evergreen State. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Brett Davis.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Brett Davis. Now let's dive into the headlines. As federal COVID-19 pandemic aid dries up and budget deficits mount, cities across the state are asking their legislators to let them tax residents in excess of the 1% cap on annual property tax increases. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser has been looking into this. Tim, can you explain to us how property taxes work in Washington state, and why are so many cities wanting to increase the annual property tax limit?
Yeah, Brett, property taxes are one of the main ways that most cities, school districts, and the state fund their governmental operations. Washington has higher home prices than the national average, which puts the median annual property tax payment just under $4,100. Now, that amount can increase by 1% each year due to an existing law enacted in 2001. Washington taxpayer owed $17.2 billion in property taxes for 2023. About 58% of that went through K through 12 education, half of which was collected by the state. Now, all of that money that the state collects goes through K through 12 education. But as we've been talking about the last few months, politicians have been warning that funding for education is shoring up and new taxes could be needed as COVID funding also dries up at the same time. Now, one solution could be raising property taxes above that 1% annual cap to 3%, like Senate Democrats are looking at now. But that would also be at the expense of the taxpayer as inflation continues alongside all of these other taxes.
All right. Now I want to circle back at the risk of sounding like Jen Psaki here to the COVID aid. Given the sustainability problems they obviously create, why would cities use and seemingly become dependent on these one-time funds? Any reason for that? Or they just they took the money and they wanted to keep coming, or they assumed it was going to keep coming?
The funds were never meant to be dependent upon. They were supposed to fill the gap during lockdowns and other lulls of the pandemic when businesses and governmental services kind of slowed or closed down. However, when the state, cities, and the school districts realized how much money they were getting, they decided to fund big infrastructure projects, new services and programs that they wouldn't have otherwise had funding for if it weren't for the pandemic and this federal aid. Now, the issue is that the funding is running out. They had to allocate the rest of the money by the end of 2024, which we just ended. They have to spend the rest by the end of 2026. Now, a lot of these areas don't have much money left. So with these new services in play, without a sustainable source of funding moving forward, a lot of politicians are faced with a decision now. Either cut spending with those new services or raise taxes to continue paying for them.
So I assume these cities, they're not saying it's not an overspending problem. They're saying we just don't have enough money. This increased limit is limiting us, basically. We need more money. Am I reading that correctly?
That is the trend. The only city that I've seen so far in Eastern Washington where I cover would be Yakima. Their finance director kind of came out pretty starkly and said a lot of this was due to COVID spending. Spokane had the same problem, but they didn't. The new mayor pointed to prior spending, but didn't really talk so much about COVID spending specifically, just noted it as stopgap. But that is the trend that we're seeing, not just in Washington cities in Eastern Washington, but in Western Washington as well, school districts all across the state. I mean, the state government right now is looking at a $16 billion shortfall over the next 4 years. We're seeing other states experiencing the same thing. So Washington is definitely not alone right now.
Right. So can you give us some specific numbers on how a proposed increase in the property tax limit would impact folks? I think in one of your stories that you focused on King County and some information from Smart Asset.
Yeah. So King County, for example, which is the most populous county in the state, the median home there costs about $601,000. And that comes with an annual property tax payment of about $6,328. Now, increasing that by 1%, which is the current annual cap, would mean paying $6,391, which is a $63 increase year over year. Now, if we increased it by 3% instead of 1%, that would mean paying $6,517, which is a $189 increase. It might not seem like a lot, but for people struggling to make ends meet, it could mean the difference between being taxed out of your home.
All right. So I imagine there's going to be an interesting interplay between cities wanting a higher rate and people paying it who don't want that higher rate. Now, you got an interesting response from the Association of Washington Cities to your initial story on the subject. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I initially wrote about this back in mid-November when the Association of Washington Cities, which represents pretty much all of Washington's 280-ish cities, they came out with their legislative priorities and saying that they're going to ask the state to increase that 1% cap to 3%. Now, when I initially wrote that article, I thought they were talking about increasing that cap statewide, which would allude to the numbers I just gave you about King County. Now, they emailed me and said, hey, we're not looking to push it statewide. We just want to push it for the cities, which is about 11% of your annual property tax payment, or about $700 of the property tax payment I said for King County. Now, increasing that to 3% instead of 1% would be less than a $20 annual increase. So I apologize, and we corrected the error. But when we did so, I thought in the back of my head, the state just announced at the time a $10 to $12 billion shortfall, which the governor increased to $16 billion. I thought, in a few weeks, are we going to start seeing some different messaging that they want to push it to 3% statewide? Now, the AWC hasn't come out and said that, but the Senate Democrats leaked an email just before the new year with $15 billion in new taxes over the next 4 years, and about $433 million of that would come from increasing the cap to 3% statewide. So the Senate Democrats are, in fact, looking at this.
Right. So it looks like you were onto something.
Yes, I would say so.
I'm sure it'll come up a lot during this next session, and I look forward to more stories on this topic. Thank you, Tim. The King County Regional Homeless Authority is designed to unite and coordinate policy, funding, and services for people experiencing homelessness. However, in 2025, the organization will receive less federal and state money. Western Washington reporter Spencer Pauly has been keeping up with this story. So how much did KCRHA's budget decrease in 2025 or this year? How much is it going down?
Yeah, Brett. So the KCRHA's budget dropped from $249.1 million in 2024 to $206.8 million this year. That's a 20% decrease. And this is the second year in a row in which the budget has decreased. Now, remember, this is the agency tasked by King County, Seattle to handle the region's homelessness crisis, which is showing no signs of slowing down.
Right now, this is a decrease in state and federal money only. What's the reason for that?
Yeah, so the decrease is primarily due to changes in federal and state funding. So let's start off with the federal source. U.S. Housing and Urban Development has funded KCRHA through its Continuum of Care program. But funding from that program has dropped by 66% to only $23 million set for 2025. Now, I reached out to KCRHA to kind of understand why that drop was. And basically, it's just some funding stemmed from the sources are expected to transfer at some point this year. So while, the budget has already been set, there will be some more funding coming as the year progresses. But with that being said, the state's funding to KCRHA is a little bit more interesting. So Washington pays KCRHA for its right-of-way program, which works to remove homeless people off of the side of the highways in dangerous areas and move them into shelter or housing. Now, funding for that has decreased 26% as a conclusion of funding for temporary shelters and associated outreach programs that the state was giving to KCRHA. So that huge decrease in KCRHA's budget stems from these sources just drying up this year.
Now that right-of-way program you mentioned, it's had some success, if I recall. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what's very interesting, Brett. The right-of-way program had a success rate of 89% for people being accepted in housing, and these were people that were living along right of ways. Now that's a positive feedback we're seeing, which is kind of rare for KCRHA and just like what we're doing to try to solve the homelessness crisis. Now, in fact, when I reached out, for a separate story I did here, I talked to King County Councilmember Claudia Balducci about her campaign for King County Executive. We talked about homelessness, and she touted the right-of-way program, said we should go after whatever's works. And she pointed out to this right-of-way program that's working. However,
so we're not cutting money. So I say reduce money for a program that's working.
Yeah, that's kind of the ironic part here we're looking at, Brad.
I see. So, of course, homelessness is still a challenge. So are Seattle and King County, they're still funding the organization, right?
Correct. They're making up the difference here that the federal and state sources can't do. Seattle is still the agency's major contributor with about $109.4 million this year. They make up 53% of KCRHA's funding. Now, mind you, a lot of KCRHA's work stems from the city of Seattle, where homelessness is very, compact, and where you're seeing a lot of the issues arise from homelessness. There's also King County is also increasing its funding from $42.3 million to $53 million. And even a coalition of northern King County cities boosted funding by 61%. But mind you, this is about a collective $400-some thousand for this year. But all aside, we've seen a lot of maybe some blurps and issues with KCRHA in 2024. But a lot of these cities and the King County is still relying on the agency to do the work to get the job done, to basically get people into housing and stay there.
Now, to put it mildly, it was an eventful year for KCRHA, right? Can you tell us what's been going on? Maybe summarize is a better term.
That might be, yeah. Let's start with some of the big changes here. A lot of issues that officials in Seattle and King County said was that the governing committee or the governing structure of KCRHA is very confusing. They had three separate branches of government, and one way that the interim CEO said is too many cooks in the kitchen, is how he phrased it. And there were. And so King County and Seattle worked together to create one singular branch called the Governing Committee. And they held their first meeting on December 19th of 2024. So now we are kind of putting all of the work into one government committee. Other than that, there have been issues with the lead of KCRHA. Like I said, we had our interim CEOs in 2024, but they hired the one sole candidate for the permanent CEO position, Kelly Kinnison. And so it's on her to kind of get the agency going again.
So they only had one candidate who applied?
At one point, some backed out, a lot backed out here. And that was one of the stories I've covered in the past. It was like, but KCRHA told me previously that they believe she was a strong candidate, and so they have hired her.
Guess we'll find out in the coming year. So now the homeless crisis, of course, goes beyond King County. I know we focus on King County, but can you tell us anything about efforts statewide to deal with this problem?
Sure. Well, efforts, it all depends. I think what we're seeing is, a clash between, do we want a housing first approach or a drug treatment, behavioral health treatment first approach? And that's the one thing you're going to see that's interesting. Well, I can only speak on Western Washington, where I'm confident enough to know that, in King County, you're seeing a housing first approach, along with Pierce County, where you're seeing city of Tacoma. But, in Snohomish County, you're seeing maybe more of a clash of some officials saying, we need to get these people, on their feet. And that starts with getting them the treatment they need to address whether it's drug addiction or mental health issues. So that's the one thing you're going to see. But this is not just an issue exclusive to King County or even Western Washington. I mean, the state of Washington reported a 56% increase in homelessness between 2023 and 24. And I mean, HUD's latest report showed that there was about 771,000 people who are living unhoused across the United States, a new record. So this is a problem showing no signs of slowing down. It seems like we haven't yet figured out a solution.
It's a bit astonishing, all this money spent on it, and the problem is not getting better.
I know, and all this money going into it, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Maybe this year we'll see some positive effects.
That was definitely a story that is not going away. We look forward to your coverage of this in the new year. Thank you so much, Spencer. Washington State government reporter Carlene Johnson recently spoke with someone from the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs about efforts to deal with the state's shortage of law enforcement officers. I understand law enforcement numbers started going down in the state during the latter stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was then compounded by the defund the police movement. What is the status of the number of police officers in Washington state right now?
Yeah, it wasn't just here, right? In Washington, the defund movement that spread across many blue states during the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests were pretty bad. And so in 2021, there was a huge loss of police officers, city jurisdictions, state patrol, county police departments. And we ended up losing about 500 officers, even though some new guys came on. It was a net loss of 500 officers in 2021. According to Steve Strand, who's the executive director of the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. And then in 2022, they did a little bit better, but we still lost about 100 officers. And then last year, year before last now, right? Gosh, it's 2025.
I know, I keep forgetting.
I know. In 2023, we had a net gain of less than 100 officers. But keep in mind, that was more than offset by population growth. So the way Strand sees it, if we were to catch up today to the per capita national average for law enforcement, which is 2.31 officers per 1,000 population, we would need just shy of 10,000 police officers across the state of Washington.
That is a lot of police officers.
Yes, it is.
So with the legislative session to start later this month and then a new governor taking office shortly after that, what will WSPC be pushing for this session?
Right now, they're getting in behind. I mean, they have their own set of legislative priorities, but one of their main priorities is to get in behind a bill, which I've written about, Senator Jeff Hawley's proposal. It's Senate Bill 5060, and it would have the State Criminal Justice Training Commission develop and put together this new grant program to help local and tribal governments hire law enforcement officers. It's got a great big price tag attached, which should be interesting. $100 million appropriation, which would come from the general fund to support the program. But interestingly enough, with incoming Governor Bob Ferguson, former Attorney General Bob Ferguson, he has said he supports a massive influx of dollars for law enforcement, which will be interesting to see if he follows through on that. Those were promises kind of made during the campaign against Dave Reichert. But this bill I just mentioned from Senator Jeff Hawley, he's got Senator Manka Dhingra, Democrat, chair of the Law Justice Committee, who is signed on as a co-sponsor for this bill to appropriate $100 million from the general fund to support the additional hiring of law enforcement. So this may, in fact, be the session to get this done. And that could be, a huge influx of officers coming into the state of Washington if, in fact, that gets passed.
Interesting. So you also spoke to someone at the Washington State Patrol about year-end recruiting numbers. Is it good, bad, ugly? What's the situation there?
Oh, man, they have been really, really struggling. And just as an aside, I have to tell you, Brett, I've got a family member who's a state trooper in Grays Harbor County. Huge service territory, right? And at any given time, don't want to freak people out if something happens in Grays Harbor County, but at any given time, you've got 2 officers serving this entire district in Grays Harbor County. That's how short they are. So right now, they've got 162 road trooper vacancies. They started seeing a lot of officers lost in the middle of the last decade when compensation rates for state patrol, which I know you've also written about, were lower than local agencies. So a lot of guys that wanted to serve in law enforcement, they're like, heck, I can make a whole lot more money working for, a city or county agency than I can for state patrol. Now, they've made some significant improvements there. But they had also the COVID effect, right? In 2021, right. They had a whole bunch of officers that left over the vaccine mandate because many of these officers sought, either religious exemptions, medical exemptions, or they tried both routes and they were denied. So in 2023, they had a net gain, State Patrol did, of 100 troopers. But again, that's not keeping up with population growth. So even though the money is a heck of a lot better now for state troopers, first year out from the academy upon graduation is $78,000. And after 5 years on patrol, you're making $107,000. Now that's even without many of the additional incentives. Like if you're a trooper in King County, Snohomish County, where cost of living is a bit higher, they're going to pay you more. If you're coming on board with a college degree already, and there's also student loan forgiveness. So say you went to college for something else, and they're like, you know what, this career in business isn't panning out like I thought. That's another incentive they'll offer for state patrol. So pay has gotten better. But the way Strand sees it, Brett, with the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, pay only goes so far, right? If you don't have the community support,
this goes back to that defund the police movement. Doesn't exactly, put out the welcome mat for people to become police officers.
Absolutely. And, and my family member that I referenced who works in Grays Harbor County, he's going to be moving out of the area because of getting married and seeking a career now outside of law enforcement. I mean, he basically told me, Carlene, and he's a young guy. He's only in his upper 20s. And he's like, I am burned out. No matter how much the pay offer is at this point, I'm just burned out on law enforcement, which, breaks his heart. Breaks my heart for him, right? But so many of these guys have felt that way, that they were not supported by their local communities. And while we're turning the tide on that, the Strand says it's going to take years to undo that sort of mental blow to law enforcement across Washington state to encourage guys to get back in.
Right. So keeping in mind the struggles to retain and recruit police officers in this state, what impact is this having on crime? How are we doing compared to the rest of the nation?
Tough to make that direct correlation, right? That not having enough law enforcement is the reason why crime data is up, but there's certainly got to be a correlation. I don't think anybody would argue that. But the latest crime data from the FBI, which came out in September, shows some improvements for Washington for lower level crime here over the last 5 years. But when you still compare Washington state to the national average over the last 5 years, murders are up 408% in Washington state. Vehicle thefts up by 144%. Of course, there's a correlation there, we all know, to the no pursuit law, which we have corrected over the last couple of sessions. Burglaries, robberies, aggravated assaults are all higher since 2019 in Washington state when compared to the national average. So plenty of room for improvement. We're going to be watching the legislative session starts here January 13th. Public safety and, law enforcement in general efforts to make a dent in some of that. We're going to be watching that very, very closely, covering that from day one of the session, Brett.
All right. Well, we look forward to more stories on that topic. Public safety, always a big issue year after year. A big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Brett Davis, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.